Hey y'all, Elizabeth here, your host. Before we jump into this week's episode, I just want to thank you all so much for listening every single week. We do put out podcast episodes every Tuesday and Friday. So if you're following this podcast, look for our new episode every Tuesday and Friday. And the other announcement that I have to make is that for those of you who don't know, I am a love coach. So, my main business is coaching one on one clients about expanding love in their lives. And I have open slots in my business right now. And I would love to have a conversation with you about being a client of mine and having love dripping from the walls of your life, just the palpable love that is inescapable, ever present, and that you can grow and expand in whatever ways that you want to. So, if that's something that you would like to do and you'd like to be coached one on one by me, please go to my website, ElizabethAnnCunningham.com. That's Elizabeth with a Z and without an E, Cunningham.com. It's also in the show notes. I can't wait to connect with you and talk about how to have love dripping from the walls of your life. Enjoy this episode. To redirect it to it worked! Boom, 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 boom. Computer 0, Elizabeth 1, only for free because usually
I don't know about that.
Okay, so we are now. Thank you for your vote of confidence, Haley. Okay, so we are now recording, so I'm just gonna go for it. All right. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of Love Dripping from the Walls. Before I introduce my lovely panel of guests today, I'm going to talk about the topic. So what we are talking about today is having difficult conversations with your family, and specifically conversations around current events. What spurred this actually was conversations around the Black Lives Matter movement, and talks about racial justice and the inequality that's going on in our nation. And what we are going to talk about today is how to have those difficult conversations where we don't necessarily need to agree on every single thing, but people's needs are being met in the conversation. We are having productive conversations, that we don't end up disowning everyone that we know in our family after every single conversation. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And again, before I introduce my guests, I just want to say, if you like this podcast is about the expansion of love in the world. So we talk about topics like communication, we talk about love, we talk about sex, we talk about relationships, we talk about current events, all sorts of stuff. So if this is something that you want to continue listening to, please go ahead, like, subscribe, rate, review, sponsor, whatever it is on the platform that you're currently listening on. Go ahead and do that now, and then we will continue on with our conversation. So my guest today, I'm so excited. So I'm going to introduce Haley first. Haley is the person who actually came to me with this topic, requested that we talk about this today. So also thank you, Haley, for having this topic be something that we are talking about. And so Haley is a bookkeeper by day and a Twitch D&D streamer by night. Haley is one of my favorite people in the world, and she's just a freaking game nerd, and I'm a love nerd, so we just nerd out together. It's true.
Yep.
All right, and then we have the wonderful Jess Smolinski. Jess is my cousin. So obviously, I love her to pieces, but not just under familial obligation. I love Jess because she's just a bright, shining star in the world, and I'm just so proud of you. But I could just go on and on and on and on about you. I friggin' love you. So I will actually introduce you properly. Hold on here just a second. Also, by the way, of the pictures that y'all sent me for marketing, Jess is winning. Jess won. There, you didn't know it was a competition, but Jess won at the picture thing.
Fine. Fine then.
I don't know. I had a saxophone in mind. Did you have 2 saxophones in yours?
No, Jess is just a
I wish.
So Jess is a designer. She is a house DJ and an abolitionist. She was born in the plains of Nebraska and is now living in the beautiful Oakland, California. So thanks, Jess, for being here. I really appreciate it. She was the first person that I thought of when Haley brought this topic to me. I was like, if we could have Jess talk, that would be amazing. So really, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. All right. So James, the wonderful, the only, the fabulous James. James is a great friend of mine. He was also, I put out on Facebook, I was like, hey, who wants to be on my podcast to talk about this? And I actually got a lot of responses from people, and there were quite a few people who I considered to come on, to be on. And the reason, James, that one of the reasons why I reached out to you is because one, you're really articulate, and this is not a topic that I've ever talked with you about specifically. Although I've known James in a coaching capacity before, and we've done different programs together as well. And I just think that you're hilarious and all around great dude. But the reason that, James, that I reached out to you specifically is because I've actually never heard your opinions about this topic. And I would love to hear your opinions. And the other thing that I want to note as well on this podcast that I had considered and ultimately decided that it would be okay that we're all white, and B, we're actually all generally from the Midwest. James is from Wyoming, which is not technically the Midwest.
Sort of.
Haley, what's that?
I grew up in Georgia, but I lived in the Midwest.
You lived in the Midwest? Oh, I thought you were from Wyoming.
That counts. No, I grew up in Georgia. I was born in Missouri, and then I moved to Georgia, and then I lived a couple of places in the South, and then I lived in Wyoming for like 7 years.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
Still counts. Still
that kind of Midwest mentality. And so
I own cowboy boots.
You own cowboy boots. Great. Awesome.
It counts.
It works.
So at first I was like, maybe I should have people of more diverse voices, and I think that I would absolutely like to do that in the future. But I also thought that it would be very interesting to have it be kind of that specific, where we, Jess and I are from Nebraska. Haley's also from all over the place, but you lived in the Midwest for a while.
Yeah, families from Texas. It's very in that central part of the United States. So,
Yeah, and I think, and all of us have very differing opinions from the general population from which we grew up. So in a way, we all have very similar voices inside of this. And so we have similar conversations. Now, obviously not the same. Obviously, everyone's circumstances is a little bit different and unique to each person. But we all have very similar conversations with family. And so I would like to have a podcast that is more diverse and has people from different places, different backgrounds, different colors, things like that. But for the purposes of this podcast, that's kind of the background that we're all coming from. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here.
Thank you for having us here.
Yes. Thanks.
Yay, awesome. So the intention of this podcast is to talk about communication styles, what works, what hasn't worked at all, how you would like it to work. So the other part of my intention is to come up with action steps that people are listening can hear our experiences and what we've dealt with in the conversations with our families. And be able to hear themselves in those experiences, and then be able to take away, maybe learn from our mistakes, and then also take away things that have actually worked. And so we'll talk about that. So this is not a podcast about, being right or being wrong, or that one political view is right or that one political view is wrong. This is really a conversation about what works in communication with our families when we really do want to keep the love alive in our family. We want to keep that love. We want to keep the respect. We want to keep the connection. That's something that we're committed to, even though we have very, very different points of view. So Jess, I'm actually going to start with you.
All right.
Yeah. So what has been your experience, and you can pick like a specific topic if you want to, but what has been your experience, or maybe tell us a little bit about the background of talking to your family, and I mean your family as in your nuclear family, because obviously we come from the same family, but in talking with your nuclear family or our larger family about these topics.
So to start, my nuclear family, so both of my parents, they are conservative, they support Trump. Especially, I think my mom, she's a big fan. She likes to watch the news and stay up to date on what's going on. As far as my sister goes, it's not something we really talk about. She kind of stays out of politics, which I respect. I feel like it's not for everyone, and we all kind of have our place in the world and what we decide to, sort of interact with. And it's been difficult because I feel like we've sort of had arguments and conversations probably since the 2016 election. And I moved to California about 2 years ago. So all of my recent interactions have been digital. The phone, over, FaceTime calls, or Facebook, social media. And I find it really difficult because the relationship that I have with my family, and I feel like that it can be this way for a lot of people in the Midwest, is you have a lot of casual interactions and these things just sort of come up. It's not something that, it's really difficult to find time and say, we're going to have an intentional conversation about this difficult topic and really sit down. And so I haven't been able to have as many casual interactions where that can come up since I don't get to just see my family as often. But, it happens with Facebook comments. It happens with phone calls where if someone in my family chooses to bring up a topic or it just kind of finds its way there, I try to run with it. And I think this is a good opportunity that it was brought up and the other person seems comfortable. And so let's see if we can do something with that. And my approach has been to sort of just chip away at any walls that exist so we can have an open conversation. Mm-hmm. And I really believe, I don't want to ruin any of the relationships that I have in my family. I respect my parents. I respect a lot of my relatives. And so, yeah, like I said, just sort of poking at walls and seeing where people have boundaries and then going from there. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I'm still in the boundary phase of just saying okay, I'm very progressive. I label myself as an abolitionist, and I understand that a lot of people aren't there yet. And so how do I find the boundaries where other people are so I can understand where they're coming from and sort of go from there? And that's been my recent experience.
Mm-hmm. So in your own words, explain abolitionist.
Whew. How do I explain that? Okay, so for me,
In 2 sentences.
yeah, let me try. Okay, so an abolitionist believes in abolishing the systems of oppression that were historically set up to police people of color. And so that is things like the current prison system, and the police, and systems of white supremacy within our government, and believing that the correct way to build a community is to be a community and have restorative justice rather than punishment.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks. Just
Sure.
because it's a very new, sometimes I think that since we use it in a new context, that people just aren't familiar. So I appreciate you. That was brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for explaining that. Yeah, and I've seen you on Facebook talk to your mom, at least, because we've had some interactions with her together, actually, on some of my Facebook posts. And it seems as though, and obviously I can't speak to the conversations that you have behind closed doors, but I really see what you mean when you say like poking at the boundaries, because what I see you speaking to is exactly like where she's at. You know, like she says something and then you respond specifically to whatever thing that she has said. And I think that that's really important in having effective communication, is really meeting the other person where they're at, right? Like I don't see you responding to her like, you know, we should abolish all systems of white patriarchy in our government, and, and all this stuff. Like, you know, that's not where you're going to. You're meeting her where she's at. And I guess my question to you is, in having these conversations on these different platforms, you know, phone, things like that. And I know that it is kind of this, I know what you mean when you say, being from the Midwest, that there isn't this, there isn't a culture of bringing up difficult conversations. Like if they get brought up, they get brought up, you know, and then they're either talked about or kind of like flittered away very quickly.
Right.
And I have a couple opinions about that, but when you encounter this specifically, is there something that you do, or do you kind of just let it flow how it is?
I kind of let it flow how it is, because I know that at some point the conversation will end, and I feel like I'm usually the one having the last say, but I try not to take it past where someone is comfortable. But really, what I try to do in my conversations is be very firm with my stance on what's happening in the world right now, especially with the BLM movement. And at the very least, I don't necessarily want to start an argument when there doesn't need to be one. I don't want there to be hurt feelings, but I do want to make sure that people understand that I am supportive of what's happening. That is my stance. And I think it's really important to always put support for the movement, even if you're not going to have these difficult conversations. And I also focus a little more on, you know, let's talk about what you're doing. Let's have a conversation around that and not who you are as a person. So like try not to focus on the way that a family member chooses to speak or necessarily what they say, but focus on what they're doing and what they're doing in the world.
Yeah, I think that that's really powerful to talk about our actions instead of, and also not making it personal as well. Like avoid, it sounds like what you're doing is avoiding personal attacks, or making anything like, well, you should feel this way or you shouldn't feel that way, or, you know, like whatever those personal boundaries are. But it's really like, okay, this is what I see going on in the world. This is my stance about what's going on in the world. How do you see it? What are you doing? That's what I hear you say.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So have you seen any headway or leeway in any of the conversations? Anything that you see is like working or not working?
Yeah, I would say like one big one is just trying to, again, see from the eye of where the other person is coming from. And so, for example, I went to a protest recently, and it was for a big labor union for the Port of Oakland. And when I was talking to my dad about that experience, you know, he was a mail carrier for maybe 30 years, and he was a union worker, and I know that that's something he's very passionate about. So being able to talk about it in terms of, you know, I'm not here trying to have a political opinion with my dad, but I can say, like, I support union members, and that's not necessarily political on one side or the other. That's just workers' rights. And I know that that's something that he can relate to. So I'm finding a way to say, it's not about Democrats or Republicans or left or right. It's, I know that this is a position that you agree with me on, and let's talk about it as such.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, no, I think that like your number one skill right now is really meeting people where they're at and meeting your parents where they're at, which is really important and awesome. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna go to Haley, the originator of this conversation. Haley, is there anything that you are doing? I'm just going to jump right into, is there anything that you are doing that you really see works? And what is it that you're doing that you really see don't work in having conversations with your family?
Yeah. In regards to what works, and for instance, is my mom didn't want to talk about anything about past arguments. But what I found what worked was actually letting my mom know, like, I'm actually more interested in talking with you about how you feel our family is broken because of the conversation. And let's have a conversation about that. And getting into her world. And when we spoke on the phone, there was there was reactions on my side to what she was saying, but listening and really hearing her, I found that worked. Like letting, like, my mom's first assumption was that I was going to attack her and tell her that she was wrong and I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
But really come from a place like, no, I really do just love you, and I really just want to know why you feel like our family's broken because of this conversation or because we have different views. And on the other hand, what doesn't work and what hasn't worked in the past is having these conversations over Facebook comments, having comment wars, texting, messaging. It just isn't a reliable form of communication when having these kind of topics, because depending on how you're reading it, of how, like, I'm interpreting what my parents are saying may not be the tone that they're saying it in, or, you know, vice versa. And so it can never be a reliable form of communication. So that hasn't worked. And I've let my parents know that if they ever do see something that I've posted, or that they've heard me say, that we call and we talk about it, because they live on the other side of the country, but that we actually have a phone call and we actually talk about it instead of having a comment war where we could not completely not understand each other.
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Have they taken you up on that? Have they actually called you? And because I've actually seen, again, like I've seen some of your posts where it has I'm going to use the word exploded, where it has just gone off the deep end. And I did notice recently that hasn't necessarily been the case. Obviously, I don't see every single one of your posts, but I haven't seen like a very heated post from you in a while, even though you've still been posting things that you believe and how you feel and your opinions about things. So have they taken you up on calling you?
So I recently found out this morning that the reason why there hasn't been any like them commenting on my any posts that I share is my stepdad unfollowed me on Facebook, so he doesn't see anything that I post. And my mom has actually she deactivated her account. She still has Messenger, so I can contact her that way, but she doesn't have Facebook anymore. So that's kind of like that reason why nothing's kind of exploded, because they've chosen not to hear or not to see any of the things that I posted.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talked with them, I was like, look, I like going forward, I told them this morning, I was like, I do want to have a call instead of doing this over text message, so we really can have a conversation. And they're like, yeah, absolutely. Or you know, my stepdad felt that way, like, yeah, we can talk. But with my mom, she doesn't want to talk about anything with politics at all. She really does have it that talking about politics and disagreeing about it tears family apart. Which isn't necessarily so.
Yeah. How do you feel about that, about her comment saying that? Is there an ice cream truck?
I was going to say, I'm kind of an ice cream now.
Sorry, even though the windows are closed, you can still hear everything from the street.
Is that you?
Yeah, that's me.
Can you get me an Astro Pop?
Yeah, I'll be right back. One second.
Okay.
Oh, that's friggin' beautiful. Oh my god. Okay.
Don't mind this. Don't mind the men behind the curtain.
Okay, so I was like, is that an ice cream truck? So is that, yeah, so my question was, is that, how do you feel about that? Like, how do you feel about her saying that? Is that still something that you're going to pursue in having these conversations?
Well, I was left with when my mom told me that originally, I was like, I was very confused, because how I associate a broken family, like a family breaking, is we're not talking to each other ever again.
Y'all should just go have ice cream together. It'll be fine.
It's a sign.
It's a sign, really. But that's how I envision a family being broken, is that we disagreed so much that they don't want to see me, they don't want to talk to me, they don't, you know, like that to me is what, if someone wanted to break my family apart, that's what you would do. And so I was very confused when my mom said that. I'm like, I don't feel that way at all. I love them very much. I'm actually going to see them in Texas on Wednesday, and I'm so excited to see them and see all of my family. So that it was a bit jarring to hear my mom say that. I think where my mom is, it gets where my mom is at is, if you disagree with your parents, it's being disrespectful. That you shouldn't talk about politics and the family in general, and that's typically been the theme for her and her family, about and how she was raised. You didn't talk up to your when she was with her family, she didn't talk up to her stepfather, who had differing opinions and political views than her. You just didn't do that. It was disrespectful to do that. And But I think that lesson missed me though. Just saying. My mom was
Well, I also
like,
think that it's absolutely a generational thing as well, where I do, at least, I mean, and you know, I'm only in this generation. I can't be in any other generation, so I can't really speak to other people's experiences, but it seems that millennials, and then what's next is Generation Z is after millennials, and but it seems as though millennials, and especially Generation Z, are like, I mean, you're gonna hear my opinion regardless if you like it, like, because shit needs to happen. That seems to be like what I don't know if that's too much of an opinion for this podcast episode specifically, but it seems as though that it is a difference in generation, that it makes sense that your mom has more of a traditional viewpoint of that because of the generation that she grew up in. Not to say that there weren't outspoken people in her generation, but just in general.
Yeah, exactly. When my mom told me that, so there's what I talked to my mom about, and then there was my initial reaction, which was, Mom, what are you talking about? Of like, you're the one who taught me how to stand up for myself. And that if someone is, you know, being belligerent to me and causing a ruckus, and you know, that I have every right to stand up to that person. And I remember telling my mom, I told my mom on the phone this morning about that. And I was like, you know, I told her, like, when my friends would tell me that their parents were hurting them, that or that their parents were talking to them this way and treating them as, you know, a certain way that was not okay. I told her what I would tell my friends, like, my mom did that, I would walk out. My mom would never see me, and my mom would understand. Because she, given what she's dealt with in her life, my mom would understand. You know, I really, like, it doesn't, for me, if you are related to me or not, I can stand up to you. I can stand up for what I believe in, and I can tell you to please stop being belligerent to me. You know, which isn't like the generation that my mom grew up in. And I think that's where the disconnect is, for sure. And so I talked with my mom this morning, and I did acknowledge that how I spoke to my stepfather on the Facebook comments, there is a way to how I spoke to him didn't work in regards to, like, the conversation, what works and what doesn't. Yes, I can stand up to my family, but what isn't appropriate is to tell my stepdad to shut the fuck up. You know,
less effective, not an effective form of communication. And keeping an open and honest dialogue, telling someone to shut the fuck up. Yeah,
in regards to, like, acting on a reaction that I'm having, that isn't an appropriate way to talk to my family.
Right.
And I did acknowledge that to my mom and my stepfather, and apologize. Like, there are going to be times where we disagree, or there's a way, you know, when we're talking to each other, or when my stepdad he does a certain thing that makes me feel belittled, that there's a better way for me to tell him, hey, that's what you're doing and that doesn't work. This is how this is for me. Let's have a conversation and stop that action. Like, there's a better way to talk to family to stop the action instead of being just angry.
Yeah. So what can you say specifically, like, so if you felt belittled by your stepdad, then now with that information, like, instead of saying shut the fuck up, like, what would something that you would say would be? That was weird. What is something that you would say? There we go.
Something I would say, I would first, what's right there for me is like, I first need to acknowledge what is my reaction and what is my reactive thing to say. Is that appropriate? And a lot of times it's not. But if I was having, that did happen again, I can just tell my stepdad, you're doing it again, where you're using your college education to belittle me. And he's acknowledged, like, yeah, I have done that in conversation, and it has come up with other people where he pisses people off because of it. And I really can now, like, you're doing that thing again, and I don't know if you're meaning to, but that's what's happening here. What's going on? Let's have a conversation. But mostly if like something happens on Facebook and he makes another comment, I'm just gonna call him right up and like, hey, look, what's going on? Like, what's there for you when you read that?
Yeah.
How did you have that reaction?
Fantastic. Yeah. And I think
Tell me more about that.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Where I think that and not everyone communicates well over the phone, but I think that one of the things that I would like to see happen is less like real, quote unquote, real conversations over Facebook, and have it be more of like, especially if it goes into that like heated, like, I'm right, you're wrong, or da da da, or like where it's like clearly the conversation isn't going anywhere. Because I think that most people can tell when it's like, okay, this conversation isn't going anywhere. It's just me saying what I feel, you saying what you feel. There's no actual conversation being had here. And one thing that I would like to see happen is to have people reach out to each other individually and be like exactly what you just said, like, hey, I saw that you commented this on my Facebook post, and can we talk about that? Can we actually have a conversation about it? This is something that I'm really passionate about, and by the fact that you posted on my status, I can tell that it's something that you're passionate about too. So can we actually talk about it? I would love to see that happen more often. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. So I'm going to switch over to James. So James, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, you're someone who I know a lot less about these specific interactions with your family, since I know you more in it like through mutual friends, and I've had conversations with you about like those relationships, but I've actually never had a conversation with you about your family. So what is your experience in having these conversations with your family, and what's something that really stands out to you as either like something that always gets stuck, or something that you've overcome? Or it could be both, I guess.
Yeah, it seems like it is kind of a little bit of column A and column B. A lot of how the conversations go, most of my family, if they're over the age of like 40, are pretty conservative, Trump supporter. And part of something that I really have to kind of source from myself, let's call it, is to not actively like make somebody wrong for just like supporting the side that I don't. And I notice that that's there for me like pretty regularly. And a big part of that is, that there's this something that you had mentioned prior to the call, is like there's this divide, right? There's this divide from the left and the right. And I think that is something that kind of gets deeper every day. And that's not, I don't want to go off on a tangent and like ultimately not answer the question that you asked. But I guess that's part of what I'm really present to, is that there is this divide of just get a load of how crazy this side is, right? And that seems to be where the conversation ultimately comes from a lot of times. And so in me having these conversations with my family, like my mom, for example, and like I love my mom, and the reason that I mention all that is because it's important for me to not have her differing views on politics, on the world, on whatever, even if I disagree with them, I can't let that be a source for me to like not respect her. Does that make sense? Like, she's still my mom. I still love my mom. Um, and so even if we have differing views, that's actually okay. I think that's actually okay to have differing views, because that's part of how, you know, your family grows through generations. Like, you're kind of, I think you're supposed to think that, you know, the young people in your family are out of their damn mind, because like, well, get a load of these crazy kids, right? That's how that's how people grow. That's how, you know, society actually grows. And so the way that the conversations typically go is, you know, Jess, you had said something that you stand really firm with, something that you believe in, right? When it comes up, and it does seem to just kind of come up organically. It's not like we sit down and have a conversation and say, hey, we're gonna hash out this Trump shit, right? Like, we don't ever actually schedule to have a conversation about it. It's just when it comes up, it comes up. um, you know, when the protests were happening in Seattle, um, my mom and my grandfather had called on like speakerphone and were talking to me about it, and they're like, hey, you know, we hear Seattle's just going crazy because we had CHOP that was going on. And you know, if you watch the news, if you watch the right type of news, it says that it's like this lawless wasteland where there's, you know, there's just people with guns hanging out and just shooting each other for the fun of it. And and that's not how it actually is or was. I mean, there's some shit that went down, but
Right.
um, you know, when the protests were happening, that sparked a conversation. And she was like, well, I don't agree with the looting and the rioting. Like, that's just, I think that's wrong. And I was like, look, like, I'm not going to condone that. And there's a really good reason that it's happening. There's a really, really good reason that it's happening. So, you know, while looting and rioting doesn't like necessarily contribute to this is going to make this get better, it's like, look, man, this is the voice of people that have been ignored for a long time. And if you ignore them for a long time, like, this is just kind of what will happen. And part of what allows me to not, I guess, make my mom wrong or anybody in my family wrong for, you know, having a differing view of it is that, number one, like, I'm a college dropout. I'm not that educated. I pay attention to politics occasionally. It's not a thing that I study a lot on. And I'm actually willing to bet that for the majority of my family, it's kind of the same way, right? Like, they don't really read into it. They don't look at it unless it's actually impacting them. And I try to take that on for myself more now, to really learn and read and participate more, even when it's not directly impacting me. And when you do that, that's when you kind of are able to see, you know, how fucked up the situation really is, right? But I guess in that same sense, because, you know, we're on differing sides, and it seems to me that we get our own information in the same way that each other does. Like, I don't always go to news websites and, you know, read what's going on and read what the history of this thing was. Like, a lot of what I get is from people like you, Elizabeth, or you, Haley, or, you know, Jess. I'm imagining if I was friends with you on Facebook, I'd probably get a lot of information from you. It's, you know, people sharing or saying things, and people that I respect and people that I hold a high opinion of, you know, their opinion. I will read that and I'll actually go, okay, yeah, this actually makes a lot of sense. But I guess it doesn't like happen independently. And so how conversations, I guess, kind of will end up going is it'll get like, okay, hey, this is my side, this is your side, these don't fit. And then it's kind of it kind of ends up being like, you know, when yeah, it's like Thanksgiving dinner, right? When you're at Thanksgiving dinner and you're like, you know what, we're having a really nice dinner, I don't want to talk about politics. Fair enough, you have your side, that's okay. I don't mind that. You know, I don't mind you having that side, and in a sense that both works and doesn't work, because it works in the sense that it's like, look, it's not going to get heated, we're not going to, you know, contribute to this kind of like that can happen as a result of it, and it also can leave a lot unsaid. And so it both works and doesn't.
Yeah, and you pointed to something that I wanted to bring up. So thank you. That's a beautiful segue. Is, you know, being willing to have these uncomfortable conversations. And it seems that all of us have come from places where you don't bring up uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
And to the point where my mom actually posted reposted a recent podcast episode of mine, and she said specifically, listen to this podcast because Elizabeth talks about things that the rest of us aren't willing to bring up.
Wow.
And which I was like, yay, thanks,
That's
Mom.
so cool.
So on the one hand, I was like, thank you. And on the other hand, it's like, that brings up a really good point. And which is why I'm really glad that we're talking today, is that, because I think my opinion is that we do need to have the skills to have these conversations. And I think in having the skills to have these conversations and the willingness to bring up these uncomfortable conversations is how we're going to start getting things done and moving the wheel forward. And so all of you brought up some really great things, which is, Jess brought up meeting people where they're at. You can't start talking about abolishing the police if someone doesn't even recognize that there's a systemic problem in the first place, right? And Haley brought up a really good point, which wasn't explicit, but I want to touch on it, which was, you have to have these conversations. You might have to have these conversations over and over and over again. You had a conversation with your mom this morning about having more conversations, right? Like we're not going to move anything forward with all of us having a conversation if we're not having a conversation. Step one in having a conversation is to have the fucking conversation. Yeah. Like step one, do the thing. And then, James, I think that one of the things that you touched on was that it does kind of, it just stays at this standstill, right? And I think that it's okay to have differing views, but what I want to bring to the table with all of that is, what are some common things that are going to bring us together? That's why I wanted to talk about continuing to have love, connection, open communication. What does that look like? Like, what are we, instead of being right and wrong in these conversations, what are some things that you're actually committed to happening in these, like, what's the trajectory here? Like, is your trajectory like, I want everyone to believe what I do? Or is the trajectory that you want to find some solution for equality and justice in the world? Is like, what is your trajectory in these conversations, such that when you have them, it doesn't fall into I'm right and you're wrong, but it falls into, okay, we're both committed to equality for people. So where are we both at on that spectrum? Like, let's talk about that. And then the other thing that I wanted to bring up as well, so there's like having the trajectory that you want, it to go, like having an overall commitment. And then there's also like one of the breakdowns of communication, and this is from the book Nonviolent Communication, is that one of the breakdowns of conversation is that people's needs aren't being met. Like, there's some need in the conversation that isn't being met, so that people can't actually hear each other. All they're hearing is, my need isn't being met. And then all this person is hearing is, my need isn't being met. And then we just kind of stack on top of that to where it doesn't really matter the words that are coming out of your mouth, because we've stopped listening to each other. And so how are we having conversations where we're hearing one another and both people's needs are being met? So does anybody want to speak specifically to one of those things, or like what you hear inside of that?
If I could, or if,
okay, James and then Haley.
So that to me has been a big, I guess, kind of place to stand in conversations with, with my mom or with anybody. Like really, most of the time when I have a conversation about politics, I don't. And this is nothing at all against my family. I love my family. They're all like awesome people, and I mostly in my family they're all on the East Coast. For the most part, and I generally just talk to my mom when we play World of Warcraft together, and so
Awesome.
I know, right? It's pretty cool. I told my friend Kevin, I was like I saw him on, and I was like, hey, let's go play World of Warcraft with my mom. He was like, what? Um, but something that I try to keep present in the communication and in the actual conversation is to make sure that both sides are heard, that I get to be heard, and that she does as well. And that's kind of part of what I touched on earlier, is that ultimately, if I was her, if I had made every decision the same way that she had, if I had grown up the exact same way that she had and made every single decision that she had, I might feel the same way. I might actually hold a lot of the same beliefs and political, ideals that she does. And so
Mm-hmm.
there isn't a right and a wrong side. There in the actual reality, there isn't a right and a wrong side. There are things that are unjust. There are things that work. There are things that don't work. And so in a sense, it's important that she still gets to get heard, even if I don't agree with it. It's still important that I hear it and that I understand it from her side, because it's just like a different opinion, right? And it doesn't work for me to, like I said earlier, I don't want to just continue to repeat things, and I know that I have a tendency to do that, but like I'm committed to not vilifying somebody who just believes things differently. If I disagree with you, well, that doesn't make you bad.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's
Yeah.
something that I have to keep present for me, is to just really make sure that everybody gets heard, and that it is okay for us to disagree. You can agree to disagree, right?
I think, yeah, I think to a certain, definitely agree to disagree to a certain extent, and
Yeah.
maybe I'll touch on that in a second. But I want to hear from Haley.
Yeah, just I wanted to speak more to what you're talking about, like where we want to go, like the trajectory
Mm-hmm.
of it. Is like, so how I started this. So when I first started really being interested in this conversation of, what's happening right now, and white privilege, and what that looks like. I remember reading this article that was talking about racism, and how the conversation was, what the conversation they really did want to have. They're like, we're not saying, in the article they say, when we think of racism, we think lynchings and capes and hoods, and that these are evil, bad people that hate others. And that's typically what, as a white person, what I thought of. But in the article, they said, yes, that's bad, and we're not saying that that's what every racism looks like. And everyone has racist thoughts and feelings, and towards other people. That's just that's the human nature, and you're not wrong for it. You're not bad, you're not evil, you're not a bad person because you had a thought. But where we are in the conversation now and today is, we can have a conversation about that you had those thoughts. You can have a conversation about how that you're not a bad person by having that thought. But we can have a conversation what led to that thought, what got you to that thought in the first place, and really debunk it, really, is what I got from the article.
Mm-hmm.
And in regards to where my family, having a conversation with them is, I know in the past we've both been making each other feel like the other one's wrong and that we're right. But in regards to that, where I want to go is where we're not wrong for have the views that we have. and and when I read that article, I really could have a conversation with myself and with my roommate Jess, who is Puerto Rican, and really have a conversation about white privilege and how that showed up in my life. And I could then really see what I was doing didn't work. And then in regards to with my family, it's the same thing, like really having that they're not bad people, they're not wrong. None of us are wrong inside of the conversation, kind of what James was saying, neither side is wrong, but there are some things that just don't work. Have a conversation about that, where the other person really is, there isn't a white guilt present. They don't have to feel bad. They don't have to worry about being invalidated for their side, for how they feel. Which was a concern that my mom had before she called me this morning. She's like, no, thank you. I don't want to call because I don't want to have a lecture of that I'm wrong and you're right. She really was and is afraid that she's just going to be invalidated when we talk. And vice versa. I also have that concern that I'm just going to be invalidated as well, which is, as human beings, is what we will do anything to avoid that.
Yeah.
We will do everything in our power to avoid being invalidated by other people.
Yeah.
And what I'm working towards is, regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's politics or religion or the weather or whatever it is that we get to be heard, we're not invalidated and we're not wrong. We really can have a conversation where we look like shoulder to shoulder, look at what's happening, and really have a conversation about that. And one of the things that I see that I can do in these conversations going forward is, when my mom says what she says, I can just ask, like, well, why? Why do you feel that way? What happens in your life that has you feel that way? Tell me more about that. What has you, sorry about this blue light, I'm using my computer for more light. You lived in this house, Elizabeth. You know the lighting situation.
I'm aware. No, I really get what you're saying in that making sure that each person, like James was speaking to being heard, and Haley speaking to being validated or not invalidated in your opinion, because then that is ultimately something that breaks down the conversation as well, where people go into defensiveness. Jess, what I'd like to know from you, Jess, is because I know that you're someone who's really active, and I also want to turn this to not just having the casual conversations that come up, and like then what tactics do you use in those casual conversations that just happen to come up, but what do you see, or I don't even know if you've ever thought about this, but do you see yourself reaching out to your mom and your dad specifically and being like, hey, I really think it's important that we have this conversation and that we keep this stream of communication?
Yeah, so that's not something that I have done yet. It's a place that I would like to be, although I recognize that we are in unprecedented times and there is a lot of stress for a lot of people and things happening in their lives, and I try to be conscious of that. The last thing I want to do is add more undue stress when it's not needed. So that's kind of where I'm at with my family. But also, in my view, and something I've seen from some Black activists, like Ijeoma Ulu, she wrote the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, which is really, really fantastic.
Right.
And she said something that really struck me on Twitter, which was, if you were to ask a Black activist or Black people in your community what you can do to help them in this time, they would not say, go argue with a racist uncle on Facebook. They would tell you to be out doing things with your community and trying to make improvements. And so I try to think of that, and if I feel like it's not the right time to be having those conversations with my family, I think that's okay, and I think that I can take that energy and find ways to apply it to my community to be productive.
Awesome. Really, really well said and brilliant. Yeah, and I think that brilliant. Yes. Yep. All right. Mic drop moment. Okay. No, I think that that's really great, because I think that one of the things that we do inside of these conversations, or inside of really any action, is that we turn it into like, if this action doesn't work out, then everything is, and like we put all of our eggs in one basket, right? In some cases. And I think that you bring up a really good point where it's like, okay, maybe having conversations with my family and like trying to get them to see that, my point of view, or like that things aren't working, or other actions that we can take, is a little bit fruitless right now. And so where can I spend my energy in my community and what I see to be done that's actually going to bear the fruits of my labors, right? To continue with that analogy. And I think that that's really brilliant. And it just points to, also inside of this conversation about communication, is that, again, another communication breakdown is just trying to like overbear in a conversation. Like, we have to talk about this has to be a thing that we talk about. And although I am very much an advocate, I want to make this very crystal clear, I am very much an advocate for having uncomfortable conversations and having it be super okay that it's uncomfortable. Like, I am absolutely an advocate for being like, you know what, we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable when it comes to conversations that have this much weight, right? We have conversations in this country about COVID-19. It's a global pandemic. People are dying. We have conversations about racial justice and inequality. People are dying. My stance is that when we have these topics that are so important and affect people on such a large level, I am super okay pissing people off. Even if they're people that fucking love me, I'm really okay with it. And I think that even inside of that you can still have productive conversations if we do come back to, Jess, I think you said it really great at the very beginning of this podcast, being really firm about your stance, and not like my side is right, your side is wrong, but like, this is how I feel, this is how I see it, how can we have a conversation about it, right? And so really being able to be firm in that stance, and also being firm in how you want the conversation to go, and not in like a manipulative way, not in like okay, now you have to see it my way, but in the trajectory way. Like, how I want this conversation to go is that we have a greater understanding of equality in this country, right? Mm-hmm. We have a greater understanding of other people's experience, like as lived experiences right now, right? Because then that takes it away from our own personal point of view and it puts it on something greater than ourselves.
Yeah.
And then being willing to have those conversations until we don't have to have them.
Yeah.
And then Jess, I think that that's just a brilliant point of view, is just not to have the expectation that conversation is the end all be all thing of what you can do to make a difference.
Right. And if I could add just a little bit to that too.
Yeah,
I think too, something I try to think about when I'm talking to someone who has a differing opinion is, the concept of intent versus impact, which I feel like is really important, and steering the conversation to, okay, what are your thoughts on this? I want to hear you out. I genuinely want to listen and hear what people have to say, and then have a conversation on what could be the impact of you having that opinion or you feeling that way. How does that manifest in your life into action, and who does that affect? And trying to help people answer those questions, and it could lead to them saying like, wow, maybe, you know, this way of living that I had could potentially be harmful to this group of people, and I just never thought of it that way. Mm-hmm. So I think intent versus impact is really important in that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, obviously we could talk about this for days and days and days, and there's hundreds of books on this topic and articles and Facebook posts and Twitter feeds, and there's just, you know, plethora of ways that we could take this. But I do want to start wrapping up the conversation, and how I want to wrap up the conversation is, you know, I want to go around and say, you know, what's either something that you got out of this conversation that you're taking away, or what's something that you hope that the listeners got out of this conversation that's like an action item or a place to stand, or something that we can actually go and put into our real lives. So James, can I start with you?
I would actually love to start, because I had something like right there. I was like, okay, no, I got this. Because something I got out of what you had said just then, something that just kind of I noticed resonated with me is that I definitely have a tendency to kind of be passive about this conversation, where it is, like I had mentioned earlier, it like gets to that point, and then it's like, uh-oh, hey, Thanksgiving dinner, let's pull it down. Let's start talking about, you know, whatever quest we're doing in WoW, or let's start talking about, you know, what kind of bread I'm going to make today, or something like that. And just really allowing for that. Like, I think that there's something that's there that really, once it gets uncomfortable, we go, okay, well, it's uncomfortable. Let's just pump the brakes and let's just kind of cool it and start talking about some other shit. And I got that I'm going to take on being more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I would hope that the listeners, if anybody out there, if you're like me, and I'm willing to bet that there's at least somebody out there who does the same thing, right? Like, I'll just see something on Facebook and I'll go, fucking agree with that, share. And then if it starts a conversation with someone in my family or a friend of mine, and they're just like, I don't like what you said about that, like, I don't even have to say anything. I have enough liberal friends that'll just pile on and go, let me explain to you why this, you know, why your opinion's bullshit, and then I don't even have to do anything. And so on one hand, sure, I use that as like, from a malicious standpoint, I can really totally use that as like, well, this is fucking entertaining, haha, they got their comeuppance. But it also, that goes back to, now I'm making the other side wrong. We're making the other side wrong, and it works better to just be okay with being uncomfortable, to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and having it be okay, and actually still progressing the conversation. And by that, instead of just being committed to, I want to make sure you're heard, I want to make sure I'm heard, that we each have like a new understanding about something, that we each learn something about not only the other person, but like what is it that actually contributes to like society being better as a whole, like that being the commitment that I come from in a conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, beautiful. All right, Haley.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm taking away is something that you know, Jess was talking about at the beginning, and you mentioned it as well, like meeting them where they are at. Mm-hmm. And also like talking with you all about this, like I'm really getting present to where my reaction to something gets in the way of what I'm really committed to happening with the conversation with my family. You know, I am quick to go up in arms and fuck you, fuck the man, and you know, and stand for what I believe in. And then forget that I'm talking to my family.
Yeah, I get that.
and like being committed to what my commitment is inside of, I'm discovering in this conversation what I'm really committed to inside of having these conversations with my family is that we have a better understanding of what's happening in the world, and we really can see as lived life, like as it is, instead of what our opinions are. You know, like what really like got me really passionate about this conversation was I really did get what it's like, or a semblance of what it's like for a Black person to be Black in America. And that really made a difference for me to really see where I stood on that. And that's something that I'm committed to, that my family and I both come to an understanding of what life really is like for people all in our country.
Yeah. Got it. Thanks, Haley. All right, Jess.
I want to say that I really appreciate hearing all of you talk and your perspectives. I find that the more I hear where other people are at, especially in regards to communication with their family, the more comfort I find in, again, being uncomfortable, as you said, Elizabeth, because I've done a lot of studying. I try to stay up to date with these things and be active, but I struggle to have this conversation with my family, and to hear that that's such a common thing and everyone's handling it in their own ways is really impactful for me. And I hope that the people listening can just feel a sense of comfort knowing that we're all doing what we can, and not like everyone is going to be where they're at, and that's okay. And it may not be perfect, and no one expects it to be that way. And really all you can do is make the effort,
Yeah. And thank you. And thank you all so much for coming on today. Thank you for Haley for having this idea for this topic. One of the things I want listeners to take away is that you can come to me with ideas for topics. But really, and thank you to Jess and James for coming on and sharing everything that you did. The goal of my podcast is not necessarily to have everything figured out and just to have it all in like this perfect little box, like here are the 4 steps to talk to your family about difficult subjects, but that we really, Jess, I'm so glad that one of the things that you got was that we really are all having these difficult like the struggle inside of ourselves, like how do I have these conversations with my family, and that you're not alone, and I absolutely hope the same thing, that people took away, that like you're not alone in this. There's not necessarily a right way to do it, but that there are ways that work and that there are ways that don't work. And where I want to leave people with is one, I implore every single person who's listening to this podcast to take one action. Like, that relative that you thought of this whole time during this conversation, share this podcast with them, or call them, or message them. I know I just gave some of you a heart attack. I totally get it. Totally get it. Some of you listening are like, I'm not gonna fucking do that.
I was one of those.
But I'm not going to do.
I was like, I'm not fucking doing that.
Yeah. The reason why I came to you, Jess, not Jess, sorry, I'm looking at Jess and trying to talk to Elizabeth. The reason why I brought it to you, Elizabeth, is because I can't be the only one who feels this way. Like this can't be like personal to just me. And I'm really happy that I'm not happy that it's not personal, that this is a struggle for people, but it's comforting to know that like Jess and James and other people out there, they it is a human thing that we're dealing with. It's not personal to just us. So
Yeah.
thank you for going with my idea and sharing this with everyone, because we're not all alone, which is what my goal is with bringing it to you.
Yeah, you are so welcome. Yes, you're absolutely right. We are not alone in this. We are all human. And that's kind of where I wanted to end it, was that we are all human. Like, remember that. You know that relative that I just told you to reach out to? They're a human, and they're just as nervous about talking to you as you are talking to them. I promise. And they might be having the same issue. Like, how do I actually talk about this? I would really love to have a conversation, or I would just love to have a conversation that doesn't end in us like not speaking to each other for a couple days, or however it usually ends. But that we can have conversations coming from, I'm a human, you're a human. I have fear, you have fear. I have needs, you have needs. We both live in this world together, so let's talk about that. And so that's what I really hope that people take away from this conversation. Thank you all so much for being here. I just so appreciate your time, your energy, and who you are for your families, who you are for me. I love all of you very dearly. And also, this is a very aside. James is a musician, and I also love to lift people up. And James has some shows and things that I'm going to highlight in the show notes. So if you want to check out James' music, yeah, you send me an email about it. Don't give me that look.
No, we don't have any shows. We're under quarantine. You can't do shows.
You do virtual shows.
Not doing any.
Fucking Lady Gaga did a virtual show.
But let me tell you the difference between Lady Gaga and me is money.
Is that the only difference?
There's a couple. But if you want it to sound good online, and you can, but you gotta like pour money into shit. And like we just got done, so I'm in a ska band called Mr. Blank, and we just are paying for mastering an album. We have an album coming out this year. It's been a long time in the making, and it's looking like it should be coming out sometime maybe in like early fall. But we've got a couple of songs that are out, and that's where our money's going towards, is not doing shows, but going like, please buy our album and maybe some t-shirts. And I really hope that we can, get out of quarantine soon. Hopefully, people take their shit together and take it seriously enough that we can open up the country like New Zealand did. Look at them. They can actually go do stuff now because they've done it right. So.
There you go. All right. And then also in the spirit of lifting people. Okay, so Zoom cut us off, unfortunately, so we don't have the rest of the recording, but I am putting James' band and website and Facebook in the show notes. And in the spirit of lifting people up, I also have some things about Jess and Haley as well. So Jess is a Bay Area DJ, and you can find her music on SoundCloud, and I will also put that in the show notes. And Haley is a Twitch streamer. She's a starting streamer. She streams Last of Us Part 2, and she is also starting another stream called Borderlands and Bitching, where it's her and two of her friends who are playing Borderlands and also having an open conversation about current events. So if you want to follow Haley, I will also be putting her Twitch stream in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for listening to our conversation today. As we were saying, I hope that you got a lot out of it. If you did get something out of it and you'd like to share that with me, please feel free to reach out. All of the ways that you can contact me are also in the show notes. So I have my Instagram, my Facebook, my Twitter, which I don't really use Twitter that much. I have my website, I have my email. So really any way that you want to get a hold of me, you absolutely can. If you would like to support this podcast, one of the easiest ways that you can do that is just share this with a friend. If you think of someone who would really benefit from this podcast or this conversation specifically, then please share it with a friend or a family member. And another way that you can support this podcast is by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts. Another way you can support the podcast is by going on to Anchor and becoming a monthly sponsor on Anchor. This is something that I do for a living. And so if you want to keep receiving amazing content, you can support me and the podcast monetarily. And I would truly, truly appreciate that as well. Thank you so much again for your listening, for your participation, for any way in which you are spreading love into the world, however big or small that is. Thank you so much. Keep listening and keep loving.